Intermediate level reading practice. A true story about the history of the exploration of America. He saw Texas first. One warm morning in June 1527, 5 Spanish ships left Spain for the West Indies. This was just 35 years after Columbus had discovered the New World. Panfilo Narvaez was in command of the expedition. The king had appointed him to conquer and colonize the territory between the Rio Grande and Florida. The story of the fate of Narvaez and the 600 soldiers on the boats is one of the most remarkable in the history of American exploration. After the expedition reached the West Indies, many of the men deserted. Many others died in hurricanes. Only 4 of the 300 men who finally reached Florida lived to tell the story of their incredible trip from Florida to the Pacific coast of Mexico. One of the 4 survivors was Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who was the treasurer and second in command of the expedition. He was a proud, adventurous, and truthful man, and he wrote many stories about his adventures. The expedition reached the west coast of Florida on April 15, 1528. From the beginning, the Indians were hostile. By the way they acted, they clearly told Narvaez to leave, the sooner the better. But the greedy Narvaez had already seen some gold jewelry worn by the Indians. He learned that it came from a place called Appalachian, and he decided to find this golden kingdom and take away its treasure. Narvaez decided to send the ships along the coast to the Rio Grande. He instructed the rest of the expedition to make the trip by land. Obviously, he did not know the great distance between Florida and the Rio Grande and the difficulty of getting supplies. Cabeza de Vaca was against the plan because the men and horses were in poor condition. Narvaez said that he could go with the ships if he was afraid. De Vaca was a proud man, and he replied that he would go with the expedition. He made the choice in pride and anger, and it almost cost him his life. On May 1st, 1528, Narvaez and his 300 men began the search for Appalachian. Nearly 2 months later, they found it. Appalachian was only a poor native village. The Spaniards were tired, hungry, and disappointed. Although they had dreamed about gold and jewels, they were now satisfied with corn, beans, and pumpkins. The Spaniards continued to search for gold for another month. However, a third of the men got sick, and the unhappy Narvaez decided to travel by sea. There was only one problem. They didn't have any ships. They didn't even have the materials and tools to build a ship. In desperation, they tried to build a few flimsy rafts. They even melted their helmets and other metal objects to make nails, saws, and axes. They made ropes from the tails and manes of horses. By September 20th, 1528, they had completed 5 crude rafts. 2 days later, 242 desperate men climbed onto these rafts and started out. The men stayed as close to the coast as possible. When they reached the area where the city of Mobile, Alabama is located today, 2 men went for water and never returned. The rest started out again and soon found themselves in dangerous circumstances. Their water was useless and they needed food. Men died of thirst, and the survivors were so weak that they could hardly use the oars. Somehow they continued their voyage until they finally came to the entrance of the Mississippi River. Here they found fresh water to drink. However, they could not sail up the river because of the strong current. After a few more days of sailing, the rafts became separated. De Vaca found himself and his men alone. Towards evening, he saw two of the other rafts. Narvaez was in one of them. De Vaca called to Narvaez and asked for help, but Narvaez refused. He selfishly replied that each man should try to save his own life. Then he sailed away. It was justice, perhaps, that Narvaez later lost his life in the Gulf of Mexico while Cabeza de Vaca survived. Somehow De Vaca found enough strength to stay awake and hold the steering oar weakly. Then, just before dawn, he heard a familiar sound. The sea was washing against the beach not far away. After 45 days, De Vaca's barge had reached an island on the coast of Texas. That evening, the Spaniards found a large and curious group of Indians. They were friendly and promised food in the morning. After they had rested and eaten, the Spaniards felt strong enough to continue their voyage. Unfortunately, a big wave turned over the raft and 3 men died in the sea. De Vaca did the only sensible thing. He asked the Indians for food and shelter in their village. The Indians carried the weak men to a hut. Later, men from another boat, which had reached another part of the island, arrived. There were now 80 Spaniards. As food became more scarce, the Indians became unfriendly. This unfriendliness became hostility when an epidemic began to kill both Indians and Spaniards. By spring, only 15 white men were alive. The Spaniards named their island prison Malhalo, misfortune. When the epidemic was at its worst, the warriors wanted to kill the Spaniards. They blamed them for all the tribe's troubles. At the last moment, a wise chief saved them. He pointed out that the Spaniards were dying too. However, the warriors did succeed in one thing. They persuaded their chief that the Spaniards should try to cure the sick Indians. As De Vaca wrote, they wished to make us physicians without any examination or without inquiring for diplomas. Although he earned some respect as a physician, De Vaca was practically a slave. The Indians forced him to work. He even had to dig roots with his fingers. Finally, he decided to escape. He left the island and joined a tribe on the mainland. They treated him better, gave him more liberty, and encouraged him to become a traveling trader. They needed someone to exchange goods with unfriendly tribes. Because of this new freedom, he began to explore the country more thoroughly. A short time later, he successfully escaped from these Indians and headed westward toward New Spain. On the way, he met some Indians who told him about 3 other Christians in a nearby village. There he met Dorantes Castillo and a Moorish slave, Estebanico. These 3 men were the only other survivors. Although the tribe treated the 4 men well, they still wanted to escape. One day they started on a journey that would take them over a large part of Texas and northwestern Mexico before they finally reached civilization. They wandered from tribe to tribe. They helped many sick Indians as they moved along. Eventually, the 4 men reached the Rio Grande and crossed into Mexico. As they traveled from village to village, the 4 men began to see signs that other Spaniards had come that way. At last they met a group of Spanish slave hunters who helped and protected them. Soon after that, the 4 survivors of the unsuccessful Narvaez expedition rejoined their countrymen on the western coast of Mexico. On May 18, 1536, 8 years after they had landed on the coast of Texas, they arrived at Calhuyacan. They were truly men who refused to die. After Cabeza de Vaca returned to Spain, he asked the king for permission to conquer and colonize Florida. However, it was too late. The king had already given permission to Hernando de Soto. De Soto offered de Vaca the position of second in command of the expedition, but he refused. Instead, he became the governor of Uruguay. After even more adventures, he became a judge in Seville, where he died about 1564. It was a quiet end for one who had lived such a wild and dangerous life.